Welcome to Wealthy Behavior, talking money and wealth with Heritage Financial, the podcast that digs into the topics, strategies, and behaviors that help busy and successful people build and protect their personal wealth. I'm your host, Sammy Azuz, the president and CEO of Heritage Financial, a Boston-based wealth management firm working with high net worth families across the country for longer than 25 years. Now let's talk about the wealthy behaviors that are key to a rich life. On this episode of the podcast, we have a special guest, Megan Gorman, founding partner of Checkers Financial Management, a San Francisco-based firm specializing in tax and financial planning for high net worth individuals. But more importantly for our conversation today, Megan's written I would say a fascinating book, All the President's Money, How the Men Who Governed America Governed Their Money, combining, I think, your interest in history, personal finance, into a very unique way of sharing some important money lessons. Thank you for joining us, Megan.
Oh, thanks for having me on, Sammy. I'm really looking forward to being here.
Me too. We've done a couple of podcast episodes and blog posts related to presidents' biographies and lessons learned by reading those biographies, particularly as it relates to money. But your book kicked it up a notch, and you basically wrote a president's personal finance book. So walk me through how this came about.
Yeah. So first of all, it sounds crazy, but the personal finances of the presidents haven't really been studied as a group, right? Like there's a study of Washington's estate plan, there's a study on Lincoln's finances, but looking at them the way that we look at our clients, right? We haven't really done that. And so this book sort of came about, one, because ever since I was a little kid, I loved the presidents. I grew up in a small town, and I loved the idea of someone growing up in a small town and going out into the world and finding, fame and fortune and becoming the president. But then in what we do in working with clients, I feel like we get a front row seat to understand what do people do, their behaviors that allow them to succeed with money, and in some instances, not succeed with money. And so sort of it's the meeting of those two things, which is we think about the presidents as being these people on a pedestal, right? They must know everything. They made it to the Oval Office. And the truth of the matter is, they're a lot like us, and they're struggling to make the right financial decisions. And when you go across the history of the United States, as you know, right, we've had panics, we've had depressions, it's been a struggle to buy houses, to get your kids educated. This is a universal American story, which was one of the most interesting parts of studying this.
Yeah, absolutely. So how would you explain how you structured the book? It isn't, I went through 47 presidents and told you how they've managed money. You took some key themes and lessons and turned it into chapters or sections?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when I first started this 5-6 years ago, I started, and when you're writing and you're researching, there's a danger, right? You're going to sort of have like a book report. Like I remember the first chapter I did was Ronald Reagan, and it was like Ronald Reagan was born in Illinois. And then in reading it, I'm like, oh God, this is boring. Like no one's going to want to read this. But it took some time, but what I realized, and I had a coach helping me, right? Because I'm not a professional writer. Writing is really hard. And one of the things that she said to me, it was really important. She said, you're not really writing about the presidents. You're writing about your clients and the traits you see in your clients. And that allowed me to reshape the book because each chapter in the book is a trait: education, risk, who you marry, luck, grit. All of these characteristics that we see with our clients, with people who are successful with money, and sort of talking about 2, 3, sometimes a little bit more presidents who had that skill or didn't have that skill. And what was interesting to find is that there were some presidents who consistently hit it out of the park. And then there were other presidents who, no matter what they did, they couldn't make money to save their lives. And by the way, some of it's self-inflicted, which is normal, right? When you work with people with money.
Every advisor probably has a client type or profession that they like working with and don't like working with. And we're not going to go on the record on either of those two categories. But if you could make a career working solely with presidents of the United States, how would you grade them as potential clients and smart with their finances?
Yeah. So a lot of my practice is working with corporate executives. So I would tell you, I love the CEO types, right? Because I love the brains that get really strategic. And when you think about the presidents and you think about who was really good with strategy, with money, with thinking through issues, you got to go back to president number one, George Washington. And I would have loved to have had George as a client. Now, first of all, I would have made him earlier than he does move away from slavery. And I want to be crystal clear, there's nothing to be celebrated on that. But when you look at a president like a George Washington, you see some of the basic skills that make a huge difference in having financial success. And the skill that always sticks out for me with George Washington is his ability to budget.
Mm.
And Sammy, like none of us like I don't like budgeting and I joke in the book, right? When you're dealing with wealthy people, it's cash flow management, but it's budgeting. And George Washington would have been fun to work with because he keeps impeccable budgets. And in fact, if you ever want to see them on the Library of Congress's website, you can look up George Washington's financial papers and his budgets. And people joke, you can actually see what George Washington bought on like July 4th, 1776, right? These key American dates. And there's George Washington probably having a guy like Alexander Hamilton do it for him, but writing out what he's buying, what he's spending. But these sort of skills, which I know for us in modern day get frustrating, what you see with them with George Washington is they create a sort of superpower.
Mm.
And that superpower is the ability to look at data and make decisions. So, as an example, right, when you look at George Washington, the person who probably struggled the most with money was his peer, Thomas Jefferson. And, when you're working with someone with their money, I would tell you, it's 50% money and numbers, and it's 50% psychology, right? So with a George Washington type, because his data was so organized and it was very detailed, when he was dealing with issues like the fact that he was illiquid, it was very easy for him to make a decision to sell a tract of land to create liquidity. And he was also smart about it because he understood that the currency was erratic, volatile, weak at that time period. And so he always insisted on it in cash in a certain denomination. So I think for him, he's a really fascinating type person to look at financially because he understands the basic building blocks of, budgeting, knowing your numbers, knowing what you spend, sort of what you're willing to give up in order to have liquidity. And he was unafraid to execute upon it. And I mention his peer Thomas Jefferson because if Washington was on one end, Jefferson's on the other. He's sort of the worst situation.
He was a train wreck, basically, if we're being generous. He was forced to auction off his possessions, loved the finer things in life. And you phrased it, I think, very interestingly in terms of how you turn this into something actionable for readers. You say he failed to connect with his future self.
Right,
So
right.
talk to us a little bit about that concept and how people can learn from it.
Yeah. So I mean, when you think about working with someone, right, and they ask you these questions like, where do you see yourself in 20, 30, 40 years? Sammy, you and I know we're doing a little bit of psychological training with clients, right?
Mhm.
Because if you think about who you're going to be in 20, 30, 40 years and you see that person as a friend, you're going to sort of take the steps to do the right thing, right? So in the present day, when you get your first job and you go out and you start to sign up for the 401k and save for that day in your 70s, you're connecting with your future self. But Thomas Jefferson, had a number of things working against him, right? It was a time period where there wasn't a lot of longevity. Jefferson does have longevity.
Mhm.
There's a lot of death, right? He loses his father, he loses his wife, he loses his father-in-law, and that death is a very normal part of the time period. And so you also get to a period of time where it's a revolution. You have a lot of volatility. During Jefferson's lifetime, there were panics. People did not have financial stability of the system that we have today. And so, as a result, Jefferson was never really able to invest in sort of building the same foundation that Washington had. So Jefferson never really found he wasn't great with numbers, but if you're not great with numbers, hire a good bookkeeper, hire a good overseer. He was never able to do that, and he got caught up in taking on debt. He thought it was a very gentlemanly thing to do. He took on his father-in-law's debt, he made loans to people, and then he learned the good life in France.
Hmm.
during the Revolutionary War, he's not here. And of course, in the musical Hamilton, they talk about it, but he's over in France having a fabulous time while here the war is going on. And he learns this fabulous French taste. And we have a lot to thank him for. He brings ice cream back and cheese, and he has one of the best wine collections in the United States at that time period. So there's a little bit of living for the moment, living today, and not doing the hard work to connect with your future self. And I think when you think about this, this is something that's common today. This idea of maybe sticking your head in the sand and not dealing with your financial issues. And one of the things that is different from Jefferson and than a lot of Americans today is during Jefferson's time, if he had proactively managed his assets, he might have been in a more comfortable position. The difference between Jefferson and sort of the Americans and Americans today is the cost of living in the country today is so high. It's
Hmm.
not always about like you saving your paycheck, right? Or budgeting. You can only budget if you've got the opportunity to budget, right? If you've got the possibility of managing money and having excess. So that's sort of a difference between Jefferson and who we are today.
And maybe a difference between Jefferson and another president in Calvin Coolidge, who,
Yes.
your chapter 6, Calvin Coolidge is rather thrifty, parentheses, or the values of money. So
Yeah.
tell us about Coolidge, because I think we
Coolidge.
can learn a lot from him, regardless of where he ranks as a president.
Totally, and totally. And Calvin Coolidge is an interesting guy, right? Like, he's very, we know him as Silent Cal. He's the president from 1923 to 1928 during the Roaring Twenties. He inherits the presidency from Warren G. Harding, but he grows up and he's a bit of like a missionary. He's very frugal. At one point he's an attorney. He is working with banks, and so he's very apprehensive about taking on a mortgage. He actually doesn't own a house until he leaves the presidency, and he's very, very frugal, almost to the point where you have to ask, is it because of like some anxiety in him? And we know people like this, right? But Calvin Coolidge was willing to spend money on certain things. And so one of the historians who is a leading historian on Coolidge, Amity Schlaze, said to me once,
Mm.
when you look at a picture of Coolidge, don't hesitate to look at his clothing. His
Hmm.
clothing was impeccable. His and his wife Grace, they would wear the most highest end clothing because one of their biggest backers owned a department store. But Coolidge was very, very frugal. And he lived his life frugally. He didn't mind having used furniture and scrimping and not going and being and spending a lot of money. And he would used to lecture the country on this as well. He would be very sternly explain to the country, you should be saving more, right? And you think about that in the 1920s and how it was the roaring 20s and people were spending and champagne and everything. So he's someone who is very, very sort of severe with himself. And I think we know people like this
Hmm.
who it's almost in a way they're afraid to spend, they're afraid to explore that side of themselves. And it's a really hard thing to be. I think for a lot of people, you want to find that good balance between being fiscally responsible but finding the moment to enjoy money. And money should be enjoyed, right? There's almost this feeling, like remember when they used to lecture I mean, you're probably a millennial, but they used to lecture the millennials.
I'm not. I'm a
You're
Gen.
not
Thank you for
okay.
saying that. I'm Gen X, which is the coolest gen.
We're
But
the coolest.
I do
Yes.
portray younger. Yes, thank you.
So, but the millennials got lectured on the avocado toast, and
Yeah.
you feel bad for them because it's a little bit of shaming. And
Right.
money is something that we should enjoy more. And I think Calvin Coolidge never really truly enjoyed money. I
Hmm.
think for him it was a burden. But when you look at other presidents, right, there are a lot of presidents out there who did, who also were like Coolidge, right? One of the presidents that surprised me who was very frugal was John Kennedy. And you think, oh God, John Kennedy's got a trust fund. He's a Kennedy. He's having a high old time. But when I went into the oral histories at the Kennedy Library, what was really interesting is a consistent theme showed up, whether they were political friends, personal friends, and they talked about the fact that he was very, very much tight with a buck. He was very frugal. He
Hmm.
thought about spending, and he didn't want people taking advantage of him. And you would get these little nuggets. One story that doesn't make the book is Lem Bellings, his best friend, talks about the fact that when Kennedy becomes president, he is in charge of selling Kennedy's house in Georgetown, and he gets a great price for it. And then another buyer comes in when it's too late and actually offers more. And Kennedy's furious. I mean, it's not a lot more, but Kennedy really thought about money. And so I think the thing is, I like that about John Kennedy. It's unexpected. And it sort of tells you why there are people who are wealthy and who are able to sustain wealth, is they have the ability to have money and know what they can spend.
Do you think he was more balanced then than Coolidge? He was careful, but he was able to enjoy it, or is there somebody else you would point to as a good example of a balanced with their finances
Yeah.
approach?
It's funny because who you marry matters a lot, right, with your money.
I was
I
going to
think it
ask
was,
you that because that's a big theme in the book.
yes,
Yes.
right? For Kennedy, one of the things that was really difficult, right, was that he was very frugal. And then, of course, Jackie Kennedy was a spender.
Mm.
And so, in a lot of primary source documents, you see a friction. John Kennedy always donated his salary from when he was a congressman on to charity. Jackie, who'd been married to him since the mid 50s, she didn't find this out until 1962 that he was donating it to charity because it was in the newspaper. And of course, she had racked up all this credit card debt. So, he was being good at being frugal, but then the marriage sort of forced him to be a little bit more engaged because he had a spouse who spent a lot. But when you think about modern presidents, I'm always fascinated by Lyndon Johnson and his wife, Lady Bird. They are an interesting pairing. He grows up poor in Texas. She grows up wealthy in Texas. Her mom dies when she's 4 and she inherits money, and her dad teaches her about money. And, her uncle also teaches her. And the two of them, Lady Bird and LBJ, spend a lot of time sort of utilizing their skills to be a very equal partnership. And I talk about this in the book, but Lady Bird brings the money, he brings connections, charisma, and they buy a radio station. And I get into the story in the book, but basically she runs the radio station. She becomes quite good at it, and they end up holding it well past their deaths. The daughters sell it in the early 2000s for 9 figures. But they are a good example of a dance. Other presidents that are really good in looking at how balanced they are, Michelle and Barack, right? Michelle Obama is very clear in her public talk speaking and in her books that Barack will like dream up a money tree. And we all know people like this. You're like, how are they doing this? Like he's like pie in the in the sky and dreaming. And she's so stable. And you see this probably with clients. You get a spouse who's very grounded and grounds the two of them so that they can have a visionary partner and a grounded partner. And Michelle Obama is the grounded partner in the relationship. And if you go through the Obama tax returns, for the majority of their marriage, she made more than him and she was the steadier income earner. But I said he was a visionary. And so Barack Obama, as we know in 1996, writes this book, Dreams of My Father. He gets a $40,000 advance and nothing happens for a while. And then when he runs for Senate, the publisher's like, I'm going to reprint this. And from the time he runs for Senate to when he leaves the White House, Barack Obama generates $10 million in royalties. And I can tell you as an author, that does not happen,
No.
right? So you think about Michelle Obama, she's paying the bills. She's the one who gets them to buy a condo and then they buy a house and she's very stable, very grounded. He's the dreamer, but together they create an equality in their partnership. And I think one of the reasons she resonates with a lot of women is I think a lot of women relate to that role that she plays in her marriage.
So a big theme, as I mentioned, of the book, and you walked us through that. You write, if you ever ask me what is the best thing you could do financially, my answer would be quite succinct: get married and stay married, but also probably choose the right spouse somehow. How do you weave that into actionable advice for clients or prospective clients that you're meeting with? I mean, I'll go on record, not the first time. I'm extremely fortunate to be married to my wife, Janine. She's probably the reason why I am as fortunate and successful as I am right now. But when I met her, I did not know that. I just knew she was beautiful and I was in my early 20s and we got married and it worked out. So
I
how
love
do you,
that.
yeah, well, but how do you be more strategic's the wrong word, but how do you take this wisdom and guidance that people have learned over the years and counsel younger people on this?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I think people have a tendency when they look at wealth management to think it's all about stocks and bonds, right?
Right.
And it's not. One of the best things I think the industry delivers to people who engage with our industry is if you're doing it right, you're getting someone who sits down with you to talk about money. And
Mm.
I talk about this a lot. Like my husband and I, we both grew up similarly. We have an age gap, but it's funny. He grew up in Massachusetts. I'm from Jersey. We grew up with like middle class values. And, we agree 90% of the time. And then there's that sliver where there's the tension, right? So I find working with someone is a good way of sort of navigating that and staying in alignment. Right. And
Okay.
and I think there's a lot of presidents out there that are good examples of this, right? Where they want to make sure they're talking about things, they're staying in alignment with their spouse. And when I go through in my head different presidents, one that comes to mind really is George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush. Now they both come from money, but when you want to understand George H.W. Bush, read his letters. He published a lot of his letters from World War II. He's very sweet in those letters. And what I found fascinating in reading his letters and the responses from Barbara Bush is they talk about money a lot in their letters. He's stationed in the Pacific during World War II. She's here, they're married, but and they come from money, but George wanted to make it on his own. And so they talk about the fact that he's saving part of his paycheck, he's sending it back. How are they going to handle college, right? How much have they saved? And so you see this in the letters, this conversation that consistently is going on. And that's a good sort of way to look at having your money and marriage work together, is it's a consistent conversation. And I think for them, the letter writing worked. For us in the present day, I think sitting down with someone works very, very well. And there's a lot of examples of presidents who were really good with their spouses, with their money, or their spouse understood them. So I'll tell you a really quick funny story. Theodore Roosevelt, big, bombastic personality, right? If he shows up, what did his daughter always said? He had to be the baby at every christening, the bride at every wedding, and the corpse at every funeral. Very true. But he inherits great wealth from his father when he's at Harvard. And he's madly in love with this woman, Alice. And he, of course, when you go through his diary, he's buying her jewelry and he's spending money. And then they get engaged and they're building this big house. Well, he ends up, Alice ends up passing away tragically. It's a pretty famous story about him and his wife and his mother die on the same day. He goes off the Dakotas, does a speculative investment, and loses a lot of his fortune. And he ends up marrying his childhood best friend, Edith Caro. And Edith, she understood her guy. And she understood you got to let Teddy Roosevelt be Teddy Roosevelt, but that doesn't mean you're going to let him run the money. And so Edith would give him an allowance. And this is documented through their letters and is talked about. The way she kept him on track for them financially was this allowance that he received. And he was off and doing his thing, writing books and running for office. And that's how she maintained the household expenses, is she found a way to manage her husband where he wasn't stifled. He could be who he was, but he wasn't running the money, which when he made a lot of crazy money decisions. He got caught up in the passion of it all. And we all know people like that. So they're a very good sort of balance for each other.
He was susceptible to get rich schemes similar to Mark Twain. And so,
Yes.
what would the takeaway be from Teddy's life and his finances before his second marriage got him organized?
Yeah, it's interesting when you look over the course of American history, there's always these moments, right, where something's huge. So today, right, we talk about AI and crypto. Everybody wants to buy, right? If you go back to the time period that Teddy Roosevelt lived in, right, in the 1880s, it was investing in the West, right? It was sexy to do that, right? So I think what I would tell people that the lesson from Roosevelt is, when there are these moments, and there's consistently moments in history, right? The internet boom, the advent of the railroad, the advent of the newspaper, there are these moments in time where the US propels forward due to changes that are happening. You want to participate, but you don't want to lose your head. And with Roosevelt, went all in with buying land in the Dakotas, and he gets burned by a black swan event. There's this massive frost, it kills all the buffalo, and so he loses a lot of money out there. But I think it's more don't lose your head. And if you do have a bad financial experience, which he does out there, try to learn something from it. Because
Mm.
if Teddy Roosevelt had not had a bad financial experience in the Dakotas, we would not have our national parks. And so he could have looked at it and said, oh, I don't want to deal with that ever again. But instead, He understood that there was beauty in the land out there and was able to give us, the future generations of Americans, a gift of our national parks. So learn something from the negative financial situations. And you
That's
know what?
great. Yeah,
Don't be afraid to have your wife give you an allowance if you're Teddy Roosevelt.
I guess so. That's great. Hopefully, my wife hears the earlier portion of the conversation and not that last sentence. So, risk management is extremely important in personal finance, and you had a fascinating way of introducing that topic and educating your readers on it, and it's poker and presidents. So, walk us through that.
Yeah, first of all, presidents love poker. It's sort of wild, right? There's pictures of Harry Truman in Florida at the Truman White House in the Key West playing poker. Barack Obama played poker. There was actually a story that Warren Harding in a poker game lost the White House china of Benjamin Harrison. Story's not true. I did talk
Okay.
to the Harding people. So poker is a really interesting thing because it tells you a lot about calculating odds, about making decisions on limited data, right? And sort of reading people. And in the book, I talk about it, but probably the president who was the best at it was none other than Dwight Eisenhower, right? And of course, all of us think about him with D-Day, and he makes the decision to send the boys across the channel. And he takes ownership of that decision. But that type of risk understanding and decision making is not something that somebody just wakes up one day and has. And when you go back into Eisenhower's childhood, he's poor. His father's a farmer in Abilene, Kansas, and he doesn't have a great relationship with his father, but he ends up meeting a guy in town who is sort of like a lifelong bachelor, but he takes a liking to young Ike and teaches him how to go hunting, teaches him fishing. And they would go on these fishing trips, and he would teach him while they're fishing how to play poker. How do you calculate the odds? How do you read things? And so Eisenhower really learns a lot from this guy when he's a very, very young man. And of course, he makes his way to West Point, gets into West Point. And after the war, after West Point, he goes to Texas, where he meets Mamie Dowd, this very wealthy young woman from Denver, Colorado. Falls madly in love with her. And I always love to Google pictures of the presidents when they're young. Ike and Mamie, we know them from the 1950s, but in the turn of the century, they were a good-looking couple. And so in order to buy Mamie her engagement ring, because he gives her his West Point ring and she says, "This is great, but I want a diamond ring," he goes and borrows some money, buys her the diamond ring, and then goes and plays all of his buddies in the army barracks to win the money playing poker. And he does it. And so Eisenhower is somebody, when you look at him financially, he's very calculated. And you see this over the course of his life. And Eisenhower doesn't have a lot of money until after World War II. He writes his memoirs. And Truman, who really respects Eisenhower, goes and does this crazy thing with Congress and says the memoirs of Eisenhower's book gets to be tax-free. He gets an exemption to this very high capital gains rate. And so Eisenhower does very well on his memoirs. And when Truman writes his memoirs and Eisenhower's president, the favor is not returned at all. Truman does not make a lot of money off of his memoirs. And the two of them, of course, there's always this friction between the two of them. They do finally patch it up in 1963 because they both go to the funeral of John F. Kennedy. Both of them are devastated that this young man is killed. And after the funeral, they go to Blair House together and they sort of patch everything up. They become friends again, and they never see each other again after that day, which
Oh,
is
wow.
sort of, yeah. Yeah.
How open were the presidents to financial advice as a class?
It's interesting. They all are open to it, right? But a lot of them, were self-made people, right? One of and it starts with Andrew Jackson. The first six presidents came from money. But Andrew Jackson is the first one who sort of grows up with nothing and finds his way in the world and makes it. And a lot of them go to the school of hard knocks. So Jackson, Lincoln, right? You learn their stories and you learn that they fail a lot of the time in the beginning. I mean, Lincoln leaves, his hometown, goes to New Salem, opens up a store with this guy named William Berry. Lincoln had no business opening up a store, borrows all this money to do it. Then they borrow more money to get inventory. The store fails spectacularly. And then William Berry conveniently dies and leaves Lincoln with debt. The debt's the equivalent of about $40,000 in our money today. And Lincoln would jokingly call it his national debt, sort of like student loan debt. But it taught Lincoln a lot. Lincoln eventually pays off the debt. But Lincoln, when you go and look at how he managed his money, a lot of it was he would loan people money. And then when he was in the White House, he would take his salary and he would buy US Treasury bonds and notes. They were paying like 6 or 7% during the war. So he became a little more focused on things that had a stability factor to them, right? We would say, if I have a feeling Lincoln today would be one of these guys who'd be like, a 60% bond portfolio, I'd be like, listen, I'll be in equities to fight inflation, but this is hard. So you see those things over time play out with some of these presidents. So learning from experience helped, and then of course the modern ones do get advice, but it's hard. It's really hard to navigate this stuff.
What do you think is the biggest financial challenge or lesson from the book that we haven't touched on yet?
And in the book, by the way, I've explained to everybody, it's not chronological and it's done
Right.
on purpose that way. And the
Yep.
reason it's not chronological is I found something really interesting, which was regardless of when you lived, right? If, 1770, 1820, 1890, today, the path to the American dream is always a challenging one. It was never easy, right? All
Mhm.
of these people struggled and they were up at night, right? Worrying about money. But I would tell people what was interesting is you start to see after the like Bill Clinton and Barack Obama are the beginning of it because both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, Bill Clinton had law school debt and Barack Obama had both undergraduate and law school debt. That's the beginning of where you start to see it really get difficult in the 1980s. And it's because certain things like getting access to school became more expensive. You think about it, our last president who didn't go to college was Harry Truman, and he, was born in the 1880s. So the things that people used to do to pull themselves up became a lot harder to access. And so I want people to understand like the American dream is still out there, but it is much harder today. And I think that, in studying the presidents, that was a good thing that they all sort of came together, all of them. You could sort of see that in their stories.
Yeah, that's a great overview. We have a lot of clients and listeners who are big readers. Would you recommend either a few presidents or a few books that you enjoyed the most as you did the research in this project?
Herbert Hoover is one of the presidents who I think is very misunderstood.
Okay.
Horrible time in the White House,
Yep.
right? But a phenomenal person and a phenomenal person with money. Grows up, he loses both of his parents by the time he's 10. He's an orphan. His story is amazing, but he makes his way up. He's one of our richest presidents ever, but he very much focuses on the ability to give back. So I would tell you anything on Herbert Hoover is really interesting. In terms of books, gosh, of course, I'm like going to blank right now.
Or another president or two that,
Yeah,
similar to Hoover, people may not be paying enough attention to historically.
I would also tell you Jerry Ford is a very interesting character. He's not president for long, but he was a man of very high moral conviction. And I think his life story and the choices he made in it really, it's a very American story, regardless of your political party. And I think both Jerry Ford and George H.W. Bush, really interesting people, and it's not about politics, right? Because the political parties have changed over time,
Sure.
but they were very good examples of wanting to be gentlemen, wanting to do the right thing, wanting to always put the American public first. And so I think reading more about them will give you more appreciation. And we're getting to that point with both Ford and Bush one, where they've been gone long enough and their presidencies were long ago that you can look at it objectively. They usually say for presidential studies, you need at least 30 years from when they left office.
Oh, wow. Okay. That
Yeah, yeah.
makes sense.
We're just starting to understand Clinton, if you think about that.
Yeah, no, I understand that completely. So you obviously have a lot of passion for this project. It's clear you had a lot of fun putting it together. Thank you so much for sharing your insight with us today and for writing this book. I thought it was a fascinating personal finance book for history fans in particular.
Yeah, Sammy, thanks for having me on, and thank you for reading the book. I really do appreciate it. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, Megan. Thank you for listening to Wealthy Behavior. If you found the conversation useful, please leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts and share this episode so those around you can live a rich life too. We appreciate your feedback and questions. Please email us at wealthybehavior@heritagefinancial.net. For more insights, subscribe to our weekly blog at heritagefinancial.net and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Check out my personal finance blog at thebostonadvisor.com. Wealthy Behavior is produced by Kushel Kakanis.
This educational podcast is brought to you by Heritage Financial Services, LLC, located in the greater Boston area. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are that of the speaker, are subject to change, and do not constitute investment advice or a recommendation regarding any specific product or security. There is no guarantee that any investment or strategy discussed will be successful or will achieve any particular level of results. Investing involves risks, including the potential loss of principal. There has not been and will not be any compensation exchanged between Heritage Financial Services and podcast guests or recommended resources.